All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the President's Lecture on Music History and Contemporary America. My name is Melissa Ziobro, and I am the curator for the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music here at Monmouth University in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey. We also have our wonderful executive director, Bob Santelli, in the audience. Bob, give a wave. Now, we have a mix of on and off-campus guests here today. So if you're not super familiar with the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music, we preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. We are his official repository, but we also celebrate the history of American music and its diversity of artists and genres more broadly with our archival collection, exhibits, and programming. We are currently in the midst of planning for a brand new 30,000 square foot museum building scheduled to open in the spring of 2026. You can see more about our work at springsteenarchives.org. And for our on-campus guests, thank you so much for joining us at this really, really busy time of the semester. And to all of our faculty, good luck with that grading. For tonight's program, we're here on the heels of Earth Day. And we are so delighted to have renowned historian Douglas Brinkley for a talk titled Mercy, Mercy Me, the Ecology, Long 60s Protest Music and the Earth Day Revolution. Tonight's talk draws on Doug's book, Silent Spring Revolution, John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and the Great Environmental Awakening, which you'll have the opportunity to buy on your way out and have signed by Doug if you haven't done so already. With that, I am so pleased to introduce Monmouth University President and Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music Board of Directors Chair, Dr. Patrick F. Leahy, to tell you a bit more about our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa, and what a joy it is for me to be in the company of my great colleagues at the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. I am so pleased to be inaugurating this special lecture series. I want to join Melissa in welcoming first all the members of the Monmouth University community that join us today. They're co-collaborators across campus that have tried to put the word out at a very busy time. Note to self, maybe exam week isn't the best time for us to schedule this lecture. So I welcome all of you collaborators from across our campus community. I also want to welcome in a special way all the members of the Monmouth County community who join us here. Visitors to our campus, I hope you know that you're always welcome on this campus. I see out in the audience some of our board members and other big supporters of Monmouth, so I want to welcome you in a special way. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to say a quick word myself about the Springsteen Archives before I introduce my friend Doug Brinkley. This is the right place for the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. Let me just explain to you why I feel so strongly about that. Number one, can you imagine any other state in our union besides New Jersey hosting the legacy of Bruce Springsteen? There's no other artist and no other artist's state that I think are more synonymous than these two. So it must be here in the state of New Jersey, number one. Number two, it should be at a university, a place that can integrate the activities of the Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music into the life of the university to enhance what that university's mission to teach and to do research, to do outreach into the community, as all colleges and universities are commissioned to do. But not just any university. It should be at this university, Monmouth University, for a host of reasons. Monmouth has been, since our founding in 1933, has had an enduring commitment to the arts and to arts education. So it makes a ton of sense for that reason. We are, right now, Billboard Magazine's, one of Billboard Magazine's top music business programs. Now, you know Billboard Magazine, and when you think of the other schools on that list, that include USC, UCLA, NYU, Syracuse, Monmouth, you get the idea how significant that is. We are one of only 27 schools across the country that is an official Grammy Museum affiliate university or college. All of those reasons culminate in what I think is one of the most important reasons. You can't have the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music at a university that does not have its own student record label, which we do in Blue Hawk Records. So for all these reasons, this is the right place for the Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. And if that's not enough, if all of that is not enough, if Bruce Springsteen, I don't want to speak for Bruce Springsteen, but if Bruce Springsteen had a university, you know, he's not a college graduate, but if he had to use a university, I think he would call it Monmouth. He was born just in Monmouth Medical Center. Those of you from around here know how close that is. He did his early shows right here on the back of this building. In fact, Bob Santelli likes to tell the story that at his freshman orientation as a student in 1969, is it? Guess who his orientation entertainment was? Bruce Springsteen. Now that was long before the E Street Band, but it was Bruce Springsteen right out here. And some of you know that the iconic rock and roll album, Born to Run, was written just a mile from this campus. So Bruce Springsteen has had a long time, I hope he would say, affinity to Monmouth, first college, now university. And so for all those reasons, this makes the most sense. This is the right place for the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. And the activities are amazing. Let me just give you a quick snapshot. I promise we're going to get to your address, Doug. Do you want me to say a little bit about music and its effect on the environmental justice? I'm kidding. Just this year, if you don't know what's going on, major traveling exhibit, Music America, Iconic Objects from Rock and Roll History, which debuted in February at the LBJ Presidential Library in Austin, Texas. It's going to have a stay there, then it's going to move to other presidential libraries before it moves to the Kennedy Center and then hopefully occupies that new building that Melissa just talked about in a couple of years. Just last night, you may have heard, we had the second annual American Music Honors event. Never in the history of this great university have we collected such musical talent together at one time. Maybe you've heard these names: John Mellencamp, Jackson Brown, Dion DiMucci, Mavis Staples. Joining them on stage, Stevie Van Zandt, Darlene Love, and of course, Bruce Springsteen, all together in one place at one time to raise money to support the incredible work of this Center for American Music. And then tonight, we have the inaugural presidential lecture on American music in contemporary America. So that just gives you a sense for the kind of contributions that this center is making to our university and to our community. So to inaugurate this lecture series, I cannot imagine a better person than Doug Brinkley to handle that for us. He is one of our nation's leading historians. One of our nation's leading historians is sitting right here in the front row and has joined us here at Monmouth to deliver this lecture. He is a professor, an endowed professor in humanities and a professor of history at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He's a prolific writer, having authored over 30 books, including American Moonshot, The Boys of Pointe du Hoc, and Silent Spring Revolution. And they're the only 3 that I've read. So I have 27 more. I'm going to have a busy summer, I think. But he's perhaps most known to all of you as a regular on various news shows, CNN in particular, the History Channel, and MSNBC. And if I may say, may I, Doug? Doug was upstairs just now in my office shooting a segment live for MSNBC. How about that? We gave him a Monmouth water bottle just so that, and they were saying, boy, you were very thirsty, Doug. He kept drinking from that. It's the best subliminal advertising we think we could do. But the reason I'm most excited, I mean, if that's not enough, the reason I'm most excited to introduce to you Doug Brinkley is because he has joined in the past year the board of directors at the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music. Who knew that one of the nation's leading presidential historians is also a huge fan of not just Bruce Springsteen, but of rock and roll in general. And when he joined our board, I think it's safe to say the academic sort of standing that we had just went up like this. He's been an incredible supporter of the center and of Monmouth University, and he's a ton of fun to be around. And that's why I'm most excited to present to all of you our inaugural presidential lecturer for this year, Douglas Brinkley.
Who knew? His voice is so strong and good. We have coffee, and it's no, truly great. Great. Thank you for the intro. You know, last evening for the Bruce Springsteen event, Brian Williams, who used to be a famous NBC anchor, is an incredible New Jersey friend of everybody here. But he was saying, what was it? A million? What was the line?
Million people are going to say they were at the event last night.
He said there, you know, it was so small, but he said 1 million people. And so I was all day today not taking my band off because I'm going to prove forever that I was here at Monmouth University for a surreal and special and evening. And it's really more to come. I mean, if that was it, but this is a snowballing effect. And Bob Santelli, great friend of mine, and Bob, thanks for all you've done in my life. I was impressed to be asked to do the first Springsteen lecture because I thought I'd get to lecture on Bruce Springsteen, and nobody has ever let me do that or thought to. But they said, no, we're a university doing a lot of things, and we have ocean protection issues and issues about climate or waste disposal, about wetlands preservation, about wildlife, all of these things. And of course, that's the right way to go. You've got to use Springsteen as a springboard to bring in some people for this lectureship that could start circulating some ideas and books around here. So let me begin by just saying, my mom was born in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and she was raised here, and so it was big. The Garden State in New Jersey was always part of my life. She died a few years ago, and I should say my wife, Anne is here in the front row. Thank you, Anne, for being here again. She hears me a lot. I don't think she ever heard me on this particular talk, but thank you, Anne. And we have 3 children, 2 in college right now and a 3rd about to go. So we're in a university frame of mind. I started a few years ago to I decided quite almost overnight that I was going to start writing the environmental history of the United States in a number of volumes because it had never been done. I used to read authors like Alan Nevins, 6 volumes on the Civil War, Carl Sandburg, 8 volumes on Lincoln, and I thought environmental history is coming to a forefront, and I had to find the right approach. There was one that you should do and I could have done, but I don't know any native languages. But it's really, it's a people's history through indigenous people and the history of America and preservation. I didn't have the skill set for that. It's like trying to write for me on China when I don't speak a language, and it's so I also have a literary streak, and it could very easily be argued the conquered transcendentalist, Henry David Thoreau, Walden, Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller's thinking, started thinking about the natural world in a new way. It would have been a great launch pad in many ways. But I decided to begin with Theodore Roosevelt, who was president in 1901 to 1909, because it's getting more into the modern thinking of how government can intersect and work to save places. And TR saved 234 million acres of wild America. National monuments, left and right. The one which I was just talking on MSNBC about presidential power, but Theodore Roosevelt went to the Grand Canyon, and to get a national park created, you have to go through the Senate and Congress, and they didn't want the Grand Canyon. It was going to be mined for zinc, asbestos, and copper. And TR, who basically was a wildlife biologist, he majored in naturalist studies. He wrote his first book as an undergraduate called The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. And he knew what the Grand Canyon was. So he took an elastic piece of legislation called the Antiquities Act of 1906, meant to save dinosaur bones, paleontologist sites, archaeological digs, and pottery and artifacts from native peoples, because Europeans were coming and poaching and vandalizing all of our sites. Get up to, somebody discovers a T-Rex, and somebody, people overnight steal it for a museum in Stockholm or Berlin. It was happening. So the Antiquities Act was a very short paragraph with elastic language that says a president has the power for science for the American people to declare a site off limit for development. Vague language that passed. And Roosevelt decided to apply it to the entire Grand Canyon, 1 million acres. It was really meant for about an acre of a dinosaur dig site. And he went to the lip of the Grand Canyon, stood there and said, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone." Surrounded by veterans, the Rough Riders, who were in the Spanish-American War, and he did it. And then he got sued, and then sued again. And eventually the court said he had that power, and it started us saving all these places. They become monuments, because a national park, you got to get it through Congress. But a president does have the power to declare places national monuments. So many, what you guys think are great national parks, were really hatched as first national monuments. Channel Islands out in Santa Barbara, Joshua Tree. It's an endless list. And so Roosevelt also was really the progenitor of U.S. Fish and Wildlife of today. All of you here own 550 national wildlife refuges. So when you see a lot of bird life and things in New Jersey, this is the beginning of not only our refuge system, but the idea of the federal government having to weigh in on things. It does no good for New Jersey's Audubon societies to want to save birds or particular species if they're migrating to Florida and they have a different state law and they're just being shot in a reckless fashion. And that's what was happening 100 years ago in this beautiful, ornate, one of the most beautiful buildings on any campus we're in right now. It needs some air conditioning. But beyond that, and that's me as an energy hog in the age of climate. I mean, it's spectacular, a place. But you couldn't do it because every person here tonight 100 years ago would have come into this wearing an ornamental feather from birds that were being slaughtered in Florida just because of feathers for fashion. It was a feather mafia. They also would take the eggs because birds on offshore rookeries would go have their nest, but they wouldn't leave their eggs instinctively, so you can just gun them all down. And we were having extermination of species. TR got behind a whole tombstone showing species being eradicated. When John Adams came through New Jersey as president, there were 1 billion passenger pigeons. 1 billion. They would blot out the sky. The last one, Martha, died in 1913 in the Cincinnati Zoo. It's a species that doesn't exist anymore. And, the bison in the West used to be 60, million. And when Theodore Roosevelt went to go hunt one, he went down to 1,500 left. So this is an era of extinction of species at a very fast rate. And we did something about it. He went and found out again about a place in Florida called Pelican Island, Indian River Lagoon, where people were just killing off all the bird lives. And he said, I so declare it a federal bird reservation, unique, because it not only gave birth to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, those 550 refuges you guys own, but it more than that, it gave land to animals. So it said this refuge belongs to a species, and you have to come by a permit or be a scientist or be an ornithologist or have a school group doing education, but you couldn't trample on it. He did 51 of those, and the Yukon Delta of today in Alaska is the size of West Virginia, given to species. This is very visionary thinking, guys, 100 years out, So I wrote a book, Wilderness Warrior, on that era, TR. It was the first of a revolution of the new thinking about planet Earth as being one pulsing biological organism. Second wave, FDR. Right here, the year your guys are created, the beginning of the New Deal and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Also incredible from 33 to 45, even during World War II. Our country started trying to rehabilitate the land and do what today we call environmental protection. You may not realize, but FDR's New Deal created 800 state parks. You can't get your mind around 800 state parks. And save places like the beginnings of the Great Smoky Mountains or the Everglades or Olympics and Jackson Hole and Mammoth Cave in Kentucky and Isle Royale in Michigan, on and on and on and on. And the year you guys were founded, the Civilian Conservation Corps was born. You pay unemployed depression people $1 a day. It was mainly men. There was a group called the She that Eleanor Roosevelt was behind, but it was taking unemployed, particularly out of urban areas, and having them go do conservation work all over the country. They've planted 3 billion trees during that period. because we had drained the wetlands, we had balkanized and ruined shorelines. We had the whole, as Bob knows, a great scholar of Woody Guthrie, who I'm going to talk about in a second, the Dust Bowl was just killing areas. I grew up in a part of Ohio that used to be thick with hardwood forest, and there are none. We abused the land terribly, and Roosevelt's administration was a rehabilitation of it. I tell you just one quick thing about FDR to give you an idea of how ardent he was. Also, just as a handy tool, Theodore Roosevelt was the hero of FDR. They were from different parties, but everything FDR did was modeled on TR. Franklin Roosevelt, TR's grew up in New York, FDR grew up in New York. Theodore Roosevelt went to Harvard, FDR goes to Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York, FDR's governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt was a legislator in Albany, FDR legislator in Albany. Theodore Roosevelt loved big Navy, big forest, big conservation. FDR, big forest, big conservation. Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, FDR's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It'll spook you when you look at the list of this. It's a resume by resume approach to being a political leader. And it kind of culminated, Theodore Roosevelt had a niece named Eleanor Roosevelt, and FDR married her. So the Roosevelts on natural preservation on this issue are in a league all of their own. And then the third wave, which my book has no Roosevelt. The third environmental wave went from 1960 to 1973. And we've been looking, it had three presidents, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. And it ended in 73 because of, do you guys realize this past December was the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act? Guess what the Endangered Species Act, very progressive to legislation to bring back bald eagles, bring back osprey, save, alligators that were almost gone, even the Canada goose that now sits in Newark's runways were almost gone, Endangered Species Act, guess what it passed Senate by? 92-0. Why? Why did Richard Nixon create the Environmental Protection Agency and Clean Air Acts and Clean Waters Act? Because the people demanded it. We demanded clean air, clean water as an American birthright because we'd had enough of the smog, of poison rivers, poison lakes. If Lake Erie was essentially declared dead. I mean, it was, I'll get to the brutality of what was going on with the environment in a second. And then Watergate kicked in, and we've tried to have a fourth wave with climate change. It's complicated because it's global and involves industrial output. We may be getting near ending coal, but China isn't. The problems of global environmental stewardship is hard. FDR's, I was going to tell you how ardent he was about protecting wildlife. After Pearl Harbor, virtually the time of Pearl Harbor, it occurred, everybody's moving around, and we had poured $25 million, which was a fortune back then, into the U.S. Mountain Division, 10th Army, to train soldiers to ski the Alps and to go, be able to live in an alpine environment. And he got a random letter from a Rosalie Edge, a socialist in New York, who did Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania, was about raptor protection. And she wrote, "Dear Mr. President Roosevelt, the 10th Mountain Division at Henry's Lake, Idaho, which is near Yellowstone on the border there, trumpeter swans will be extinct because the trumpeter swans don't migrate They stay there because Henry's Lake is a thermal, warm water, doesn't freeze, and they can winter there. But they're blowing up everything near Henry's Lake. Artillery exercises, people just shooting the swans for fun. And the species was so rattled, they were staying, they're not leaving, and their numbers were dwindling at an extraordinary way. This is Pearl Harbor, guys. That's the kind of letter most presidents don't read. And Roosevelt looks into it, and he asks Secretary Henry Stimson, Secretary of War, what's going on at Henry's Lake? He got a report back, and then Roosevelt writes to the Secretary of War Stimson, I've looked into the situation now of the U.S. Army versus the trumpeters, and the verdict is in. The U.S. Army must denest. And he closed it to save it for trumpeter swans, and they moved to Camp Hale, Colorado, where David Brower, the great 60s leader of Sierra Club and all, was trained to do alpine skiing. Why? Is it just fickle? Roosevelt's bird watching enthusiast? It's because it was seen that that's what we were fighting for. If you guys aren't fighting to save New Jersey, trees and wildlife and things, what are we fighting for? It's our homeland. We're built in America through indigenous people, but also our way of thinking about the outdoors and wilderness and the natural bounty and things. So he was sending a broad message, Roosevelt, don't screw around with parks, monuments, saying we need something. We're there to protect it. But that 60s period, I wanted to write Silent Spring. It actually begins in 1945. Because in environmental thinking, you guys are living with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was the game changer for everybody. Because 98% of America, I'm making that stat up, but almost unanimous, were thrilled of victory over Japan. But there were a group of artists and intellectuals who, as early as 45, started saying, this is a doomsday. The atomic bomb is going to destroy planet Earth. And one of them, Norman Cousins, was the head of literary magazine. He created Sane with musicians, friend of Pete Seeger, and went on and on. And doing that, and he was opposed. William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice, didn't like the bomb, but there were only kind of a few voices. But there became in our government and Fish and Wildlife, Rachel Carson, who started writing pamphlets about every wildlife refuge, and she became the greatest writer. She was born in Pennsylvania, never saw the ocean ever, went to Chatham's Women's College. They found that she had a gift for Darwin, like writing, science, literature, humanities meets STEM. And she got a fellowship after graduation at Woods Hole in Massachusetts, which is down the road from Kennedy's compound in Hyannisport. And Rachel Carson fell in love with this, your ocean Atlantic seaboard. And she dedicated her life to doing radio scripts, TV, anything she could to promote the ocean conservation. Beautiful books. If you've never read one of her books, read Rachel Carson writing about the ocean, your backyard, the Atlantic. It's stunning. It stays for the time. It's as important of work on the oceans as Thoreau or Emerson or Edward Abbey or Annie Dillard. It's just this classic writing she did. But she also started working against atomic weapons and against DDT and chemical poisons. I talked about women at TR's generation. Any man going into World War II would have volunteered gladly, if you're being shipped to the Pacific, to be doused in DDT. It killed lice, mosquitoes, and it was a deterrent for malarial diseases. Can't blame anybody. I was spray me. But Carson and Barry Commoner, who was a scientist, and a handful of others started recognizing that DDT is cancerous, creates leukemia clusters, it will kill species. It will destroy humans eventually if dumped like it was being dumped from aerial planes for agriculture to kill mosquitoes. And very bravely, there's any of you here of an age that remember the name Dr. Benjamin Spock? I promise you he's not talked about a lot by today's college students, but he was the baby pediatrician. His book was big. Well, his sister, Marjorie Spock, lived in Suffolk County, Long Island, and it spread getting out towards the Hamptons, and aerial planes, mosquito control, and USDA were blanket spraying her organic farm. And she sues, and it goes to Supreme Court, because she said, my right as an organic farmer is being stripped from me. How can I be an organic farmer when people are dropping all this over my property? However you would feel about it, you can see why it makes for an interesting Supreme Court case. You know, what do you control over your property and airspace? I mean, it had a lot of things. It was a big case, and she loses. But in her loss, William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice, did a dissent. It went into Reader's Digest, and it triggered a vast movement against the chemical industrial order, and it became kind of a kinetic growth of what we call the environmental movement of today. Environmental movement as a term wasn't used till 69, came common in 70. It was conservation all the way through. Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson were shopping the new conservation. But environment kicks in, and ecology, and earth science. The progenitors of this, with the exception of Carson and the exception of Rooseveltianism, comes largely out of the arts community, and it comes a lot out of the musicians after Rachel Carson writes an anti-DDT book called Silent Spring in 1962. Rachel Carson's book, she was dying of cancer. She got breast cancer, and she dies. Books comes out in 62. Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy, was asked at a podium, it ran in the New Yorker, what about all these poisons going in, pesticides? And he said, which a smart answer, we're going to put up the best scientists and find out whether she's right. They did, the best from Harvard, best from MIT, best from Princeton, etc. And they found indeed Carson was right, that this was making people sick. And then the thought is what Carson's book did in 62. It's rare. You can get Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Civil War era. You can get Upton Sinclair in the meatpacking industry at the Jungle. Carson's book, out in 62, she dies of cancer 64, told all of us, you know what, Rooseveltian stuff's great, I'm one of them, but it's a wider movement because it's about your kid and your kid getting sick playing in their own backyard. It's not about saving Devil's Tower, Wyoming, isn't it pretty? It's not about saving these spots. You, as a mother or father, children are ill. They're going to die sooner if they swim in your local river. To give you one tangible idea, guys, Jimmy Carter is now 99 years old. Plains, Georgia, born without electricity. He'll be 100 on October 1st this year. Do you realize that area, the peanut farms and crops, they didn't know the balance of DDT and these kind of chemicals were blanket spraying in agriculture, became what we call a cancer cluster of area of environmental health problems. Do you realize Jimmy Carter's mother died of pancreatic cancer? His father died of pancreatic cancer. His sister Gloria died of pancreatic cancer. His sister Ruth died of pancreatic cancer. His brother Billy died of pancreatic cancer. You died of it if you lived there. Carter went in the U.S. Navy and was gone for the spray years. That's a president. I'm telling a little story, but it's right at large for areas where it was being misapplied. And suddenly the groundswell of saving the environment kicked in. and it became a movement, and music was a huge part, and artist. Back to Bob Santelli, Woody Guthrie did not have that kind of environmental consciousness of a Rachel Carson. But when you think about this land is your land, it's been applied to environmental causes. People will sing it as saving, because if you know the chorus, of the redwoods forest, and it's this land. It's been adopted and hijacked as a environmental ballad. It has been hijacked for other purposes too, but it was intense, very intense in the environmental movement, because Woody Guthrie's, the Secretary of Interior in the 60s, was a Woody Guthrie fanatic. He'd write intros to anything of Woody, loved Woody Guthrie. And so Woody Guthrie's songs, not just about workers or about anti-fascism, can be, and there are others that about the big man's killing the fishing hole, and you can go, we're looking at now all of the lyrics, and you can pick out these, but that channeled through whatever that land protection, the Dust Bowl is killing America, the Dust Bowl is an ecological disaster, we would call it today, really through his friend and protege Pete Seeger. And Pete Seeger, as many of you know, is one of the most important environmental figures in post-World War II America, because Seeger got it all. He was part of the Rachel Carson movement. He understood the desperate need to reclaim our treasured landscapes from sea to shining sea, from the Great Lakes to the Redwoods to the Painted Desert to the Olympics to the Texas Panhandle to southern Florida to the Piedmont of Virginia. It was what America was, and yet Pete Seeger was living right down the road along the Hudson, where FDR lived his whole life. Born along the Hudson, died there. The Hudson River Valley was really important for artists, painters, people that were thinking about landscapes and all. And Seeger started writing songs and thinking about ticky-tacky houses, developments couldn't be there, polluting factories, on and on. And you can follow Pete Seeger's trail and see Odetta doing environmental things. You can see Buffy St. Marie doing environmental things. You can see songs emanating out of Bob Dylan that can be interpreted as environmental, like a hard rain's going to fall, or what nuclear fallout means. I hope you all know from 45, only one time in world history did one country have a nuclear monopoly. United States, 45 to 49. Then Russia, of course, gets the bomb. But do you fully realize that the U.S. blew up 1,054 nuclear weapons in our country? We were blowing them up on the Marshall Islands, killing that ecosystem. We're blowing them up in Nevada, left and right. They're downwinders, people sick from the atomic fallout. It came all the way to the east. It was that big of problem until it started being consciousness raising in the 60s about it. And John F. Kennedy, you'll hear a lot about Kennedy in life. He knew, Ted Sorensen, a speechwriter, knew his single greatest thing he did in his life was a nuclear test ban treaty, banning the testing of nuclear weapon in the atmosphere and underwater. Big. Because up until that point, we're just throwing all of this nuclear fallout out there. And so there's this connection between like the nuclear bunker, duck and cover, hard rain's gonna fall. Is it nuclear fallout, or is it what becomes acid rain out of there? I mean, all of this kind of gets swirled together in the early 60s. And of course, Seeger going on a schooner up and down the Hudson River really deserves a massive amount of credit for rebringing the Hudson River back to life, saving the river for what it is, and through his personal political commitment and traveling and singing, waking up local grassroots environmental groups, save your local river, save your local lake. He started a musical consciousness about ecological concerns. In 1960, Time Magazine's Person of the Year was scientist. Now meaning we were believing in experts. We're not doing that right now. But when we were believing in experts, they were coming up with, here's what's happening, this river is this species happening to this. The symbol of DDT that was so important was that it was killing the bald eagle, our national symbol dwindling. It thinned the eggshells. No eagles in America. What are we? And it became a big, the movement of the 60s grew and grew and grew to the point we started doing things like a Clean Air Act in 63, which attacked stationary pollution. Factories had to be regulated. And we started doing air quality, water quality things. But the big movement in how music of Seeger and a few others, Richie Havens, a handful that really were prioritizing environment, like Jackson Browne does. It starts bulldozing its way through the Vietnam War. And the idea of the teach-ins of Vietnam, to sit and protest the war, gave the brainstorm to Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin, to have Earth Day. The first Earth Day becomes 1970. April 22nd, 1970. Let me say about Carson, I mentioned she died in 64, but we had a DDT war to ban it. It went from 62 to 72. DDT gets banned finally by William Ruckelshaus, the first head of the EPA under Richard Nixon. So that 10-year period, many of the fights were local music acts or jamborees or people coming to events were tied to environment and anti-Vietnam and civil rights. If you think environment was not affected as issues for Black America, you'd be wrong. The environmental justice movement of the 60s and is triggered in so many ways, like Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King, who went to Antioch College, Yellow Springs, Ohio. Her number one issue was not integration, it was stopping nuclear testing and pesticides. She was protesting everywhere. She went to the UN on it, Coretta Scott King. The other great ally of all this is Joan Baez, deep into the environment early on in the 60s, going to any local fair, jamboree, where she could and what she could for the environmental cause, following the trails of Pete Seeger. But the Vietnam War gave, for Black Americans, I interviewed John Lewis and Andy Young, the close associate of King, and all these things are about the environment, guys. They just don't tell you that sometimes. The Montgomery bus boycott, December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks' arrest. It wasn't just the indignity of sitting in the back of the bus. That's where, with no air conditioning, the diesel fumes were coming in, and these black soot, 100 degrees humidity, with all of that dirty oil exhaust. It's environmental justice issue, as we call it today. Dr. King's dying at the sanitation strike in Memphis, getting killed there. Out west, the first true environmental group that today a progressive, if you're here, would say recognize as being kind of a progressive environmentalism was the United Farm Workers of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Pesticides and chemicals are killing workers. We're being treated where they're poisoning our environment. And people like King and Dr. King or Cesar Chavez, they generated crowds by music. I mean, the I Have a Dream speech of King, Odetta's there, Bob Dylan's there, It's integrating this idea of folk music, the folk revival, rock and roll. It's starting to pull into being an environmental, part of the environmental movement as a big plank. The musicians got very interested in the 60s of Wales, because it was the first time we had recordings of Wales sounds and the music they made, and the sounds of the natural world. But when Nixon gets elected in 1969, there's this environmental movement going on, and with music, and Pete Seeger and his friends, Tom Chapin and Tom Lear and others stopped a Bodega Bay nuclear plant from being built on a fault line in California. In order to hold rallies, you had musicians there. To hold civil rights things, you're singing the Highlander, We Shall Overcome, the song of the movement, was born at Highlander Folk School in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where everybody would learn the song to chant and march, We Shall Overcome. So music is just, when we think of the 60s, you think of all this, but the culminating point is Nixon's election. He's president a handful of days. The environmental people are furious. They know Nixon's going to be a disaster. And days, karmically, he's in office, and you have the Santa Barbara oil spill. Paradise. Santa Barbara, blue waters, gook. Get the oil out now. First mistake Nixon makes, and then he self-corrects. He downplays what's going on there. Well, guys, looking at nature in Ansel Adams photograph in black and white is incredible. And he was a leading environmentalist, Ansel Adams. But in 1967, the nightly news turned color. And TV, you're now watching Santa Barbara in color TV in your living room decimated. And it stoked everybody in California, where so many artists that we treasure started joining Get the Oil Out of the Ocean. It became, a movement in Southern California. All the folk musicians, the Laurel Canyon people, the people that moved out to California. And then Nixon started minimize it's not that bad. And his governor, Walter Hickel, former governor of Alaska, kind of a libertarian, went Interior Secretary there and calls Nixon and says, don't minimize. It's horrible. And you started getting Nixon worried that the environment was co-opting you guys, the people. That was in early 69, the summer of 69. Nixon couldn't believe when Neil Armstrong's walking on the moon. Big deal. Time magazine and others, but particularly Time, which mattered back then, had the Cuyahoga River on fire in Ohio. Rivers on fire. I mean, you don't have to be a poet you just take rivers on fire and write a hellscape, and you have a song. And then cut to Gaylord Nelson stealing from civil rights, the Highlander thoughts, but also the Vietnam protests to say, we're going to do a teach-in for the environment. And it becomes the idea of Earth Day. Do you realize there was no Earth Day? They debated the name of it. But the question Nixon asked is, he's watching a Democratic, liberal, anti-war senator galvanizing young people through concerts and poetry reading and the like, is where's this money coming from? Because almost like mushrooms after some weird storm, every night some new Earth Day office was opening, or there was this synergy that people couldn't figure out, where is it all coming from? And Nixon demanded answers, and it was coming from Walter Reuther and the United Auto Workers. That's how big the alliance was between labor and the green movement of the 60s. Why was it such a big deal? Because Luther was saying any worker, people Bruce Springsteen writes about, working Americans should have clean lakes, clean rivers, forest. They can't afford working people to go to Yosemite for their week out. They need local, healthy environment to raise kids that are healthy. And as Earth Day builds, Nixon tries to co-opt the issue because he was terrified of Senator Ed Muskie of Maine, that Muskie was going to be his nominee in 72, and Muskie was embedding himself as Mr. Clean and all of this. And Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington, was the only major real Democrat of note who was pro-Vietnam War, pro-Nixon's war. Meaning on the liberal left, you had George McGovern and Ted Kennedy and Birch Bayh and Frank Church and Gaylord Nelson and Eugene McCarthy, and just rattle them off, dissing Nixon every minute for Vietnam. And Scoop Jackson was also an environmental senator. He was pro-war environment. He's Boeing in Seattle and the big national parks in Washington State. And Nixon says, I'll cut a deal with the Democrats. And on the first day of 1970, knowing this Earth Day thing's coming, Nixon signed something that's changed all of our lives, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, which says when you're building new construction, you have to have an environmental impact statement. Meaning, if you guys have undergrads that go here and you're studying environment and you're wondering what you're doing with it, everybody's hiring somebody for environment. Every company, every builder, every real estate outfit. It gave birth to environmental law, which is ubiquitous today. So it's giant, and it's coming out of Nixon and Scoop Jackson's alliance. Earth Day's coming, Nixon doesn't know what to do. He's the butt of humor on the left. No musician could even make it in rock and roll if they were a Nixon fan. And so Nixon takes a photo in a suit of shoveling dirt on the White House and planting a tree with Pat. Lets that goes out. He gave Interior Department people a day off, and he turned FBI and other groups to domestic surveillance on these environmental activists, this is not apocryphal language or me making up. He wrote a memo. I know somehow this is a pinko commie plot, Earth Day. And he was trying to play the politics of it, not get nailed, because it could have been violence. It could have turned weird. Who knows? We're living in days where we're turning on our TV sets, where radio with campuses in disarray, and here it is, Earth Day, the largest protest or mass gathering. And it was beautiful. And people were listening to, and music that grew out of Earth Day, of Joni Mitchell, big, Paved Paradise, put up a parking lot, Big Yellow Taxi, coming out of Earth Day. You have, Marvin Gaye out of the R&B world with the classic song Mercy Me, the Ecology, folding in to this movement with their music. You have artists like Neil Young and David Crosby, and the Jackson Browne and the continuation of Joan Baez. These are people prioritizing the environment in very real ways. And why are they connecting it to the Vietnam War so much? How can we save a river or lake here if we're taking chemicals and pouring Agent Orange and the like all over Vietnam to kill the jungles? It's an ecological, man-made apocalypse going on. And so you can forgive people for saying, protesters saying on the environmental movement, this is a global problem. And it's not about saving a park in New Jersey or doing a little bit for the Pine Barrens. We are massively, the United States, 6% of the world's population using 35 to 40% of the natural resources, while we're blanket bombing and destroying vegetation in places, it starts getting swirled together, certainly in the minds of people like the Grateful Dead, Bob Ware, Jerry Garcia, which they'll continue throughout their career for rainforest preservation. But Earth Day went without a hitch. The big thing was to get a musical act or a poet or a major political force on every campus, every street. Mayor Lindsay, who, and there have been concerns in New Jersey of fresh kills and these dump sites, or how New York City was sending all of its toxic debris and it would hit New Jersey from needles to it was all in a very raw way. And so the Earth Day just broke out, and it proved that it wasn't a folky cult. It's not a Joan Baez or Beat Generation poem. That the numbers of Carson versus rock and roll, pop music, singer-songwriter music, and artist, Robert Rauschenberg, the great painter, did the first art, the posters for Earth Day. One of our greatest painters. Andy Warhol did a whole series of endangered species. That's just naming two. It's an endless group of people. Film world. I mean, it started with Walt Disney's True Life Adventures in the 50s about coyotes or something. Disney was a conservative Goldwater guy, but he loved critters. Because he got so much material out of watching their twitches or scratches or behaviors, and he was part of it. And he did a film called about seals, Disney, where there was no language, just classical music, watching the daily behavior of seals. This was a wealthy, big Walt Disney. Nobody would distribute it because it was an environmental film, and he cleverly, it's how clever Disney was, he rented a theater out in Pasadena and sold no tickets, rented it for a week. But if you ran it for a week, you could then be nominated for an Academy Award in a category. And then he pushed it and got the Academy Award, although nobody ever saw it. It was just on the fact that it had a theater opening at this. But that notion, Disney wins for a film on seals, TV shows of the 60s started picking up, like Flipper, about a dolphin, and your porpoise is your best friend, and all of the natural history, coming to life. And after that first Earth Day, it comes with a steady drumbeat, guys, this pushing of the music industry and artists constantly reminding us today, whether it's Billie Eilish or Taylor Swift, or whether it's endless artists are leading the crusade for climate. I mean, I was just at an event with Bill McKibben, a great environmentalist up in Vermont a week ago, and all he's looking for is singers. He's looking for what you had there last night, guys. I mean, that's going to draw the people. The music's where you're getting the crowds. That's going to get the spirit going. That's going to get, and so we've been lucky and blessed that the arts community, visual, film, and poets. I mean, when I mentioned Beat Generation, I mean, the great poets and writers like Gary Snyder, the beat writer, Allen Ginsberg, Diane DePrima, they were talking about land stewardship. And we were talking in music about Native Americans, the saving of the bison, saving of eagles. Think of like John Denver, who I was never a big fan of personally, but I know he wrote some good songs. He's all in, on environment. It became and still is an important thing. If you look at any big climate activist moment, it's going to be the music that and a celebrity star, people that are listening to the airwaves. We don't have a climate change song like We Shall Overcome for Civil Rights. All of these climate rights, nobody's written a song. Jackson Browne has the chops to do it, and so does Bruce Springsteen. But it's kind of hard to not do it some of the better 60s ones were satires, about, overdevelopment or the like. So there's an opening there for that. I think the Grateful Dead did in California a huge amount on working on climate, and the surviving members still do, or working on rainforest, the depletion of our planet. And it's a tradition that is there. We don't talk about it much. We're not giving awards. Here's the environmental, popular musician of the year. But they're there everywhere, and when you listen to music in general, it's tied to the rhythms of the natural world. Not just the whales, but to the tides and the breeze. And there's a something about it that makes our minds, clear. And one of the things universities have to do in high schools is kind of wake people up to the beauty of the natural world, because we have so many illnesses in our society, but we have a true nature deficiency disorder where people, Ginsberg had a poem about, there used to be a singer, Engelbert Humperdinck. How many of you remember that name? You don't hear it much, but it was a big deal. And Ginsberg, not to make fun of Engelbert Humperdinck in particular, but as kind of a metaphor for his idea, said, Engelbert, do you know what mountain range you're singing in? Meaning, when you went to Vegas, do you know anything about the environment around you? And the answer for most of us becomes no. We know where the Starbucks is. We know where the Burger King is. We know where the freeway exit is. But we've disconnected ourselves in an unhealthy way from our natural world. And that has dire and deep consequences. Part of it was from leaving a rural America to an urban America. We were a nation of farmers, and by being a farmer, you're dealing with the weather, you're dealing with almanacs, you're dealing with animal life, you're doing hunting, fishing, you're knowing. But I will end by telling you I do believe we did a lot of good. We have a great national park system. We cleaned the lakes. I mentioned Lake Erie. Dr. Seuss wrote in the Lorax about Smeary Lake Erie. And I saw a letter he then wrote, Theodore Geisel, but Dr. Seuss. He wrote, a group of school kids said, we've been working to clean Lake Erie, and it's not like it was. The fish are back. Just a kid group letter. And he changed his edition before he died got rid of the Smeary Lake Erie, because he realized that had influenced people to do something, and they did make it better. And so whether you're in California, and in the 60s, you couldn't see Pasadena. The smog was so intense. The Great Lakes were dying. Our rivers were shot due to a confluence of the public demanding. It didn't matter, Democrats and Republicans, the country started pulling together for the spat of big things. And it was Rachel Carson, an artist, that kind of pulled it all together and gave ecology this sort of feeling, the outdoor world of feeling of grandeur, and things like in the Silicon Valley, the Whole Earth catalog came out right at the time of Earth Day. And you had writers like in Edward Abbey, and Rosalie Sorrells, and out in the Pacific. Artists would get together and save particular places and all. I hope, I teach at university for a long time, and I've seen some of the angst of college students with climate. My God, am I guilty? I took a Uber here with gas, and is electric really the thing? And should these lights be off to save energy? And why are we having plastics? But I thought I loved the outdoor world. And it's making us all crazy and neurotic because we all love the planet. You all love New Jersey here. We all want to be better caretakers. So I tell students, look, if you got the chops to get into the climate world in the biological world or in a new energy alternative, go for it. But don't get sick over it. The big thing I learned from what the music contributed in the 60s, and maybe the marijuana, but was have fun saving the planet. You can't do it out of an angst pain play. You gotta have fun, have a pizza party, get together, get involved, and you can spend an hour a week, if that's all you have, to work on a local conservation, meaning environmental group or club, or a beach cleanup, or but start knowing people and start caring. Put a time limit. Don't ruin your job. Make money. Stay happy. No suicide. No depression. World, we're going to figure this out. But do start talking about it, because that fourth wave, I gave you the 3 waves, is coming. You can feel it when it's not Greta, triggering young people. Al Gore, did for a while, but it didn't quite turn. But at some point, everybody's going to be connected. Everybody working in the preservation, conservation, environmental, climate, etc. spaces will be a leadership wave where we can really do something. I think Biden, with some of his infrastructure stuff's making strides. Barack Obama, when I talk about national monuments with TR, Obama saved that nobody really gets the press. 1.7 million acres in Nevada, San Juan Islands in Washington. He opened up the History Net, saving the first LGBTQ site in Stonewall in New York. Cesar Chavez's whole site in Burial Home as a national park through Obama. Bears Ears in Utah. Obama administration brought in 5 native tribes to manage federal lands in a whole new way. We are starting to learn about regenerative agriculture and how to grow food in a new way, minus these kind of industrial fertilizers and chemicals. It's starting to take hold in farm-to-table movements. It's coming. But all the great things about World War II and our win, and thank God we did, we also greenlit every chemical known. Anybody who had a concoction in their laboratory could spring it on. And it might seem like World War II was a long time ago, but it's taken that long for our regulatory structure and science to start determining the effects of all of this on a planet. And, so there is an uptick out of... and some of the older environmental groups that I write about in my writing, particularly Sierra Club of David Brower, Riverkeeper groups and all this, are meeting with the new Sunrise Movement, and things are happening there. But anything in environment can't happen overnight. It takes an informed, educated public, but I don't think you can do it by law and politics. It's got to be cultural. It's okay to get back to air and earth and get moved by feeling a calling to protect your sacred places. I end by telling you I was filming last week for Ken Burns, who's doing Henry David Thoreau, famous Walden Pond, right? You go around Walden Pond, and a takeaway from Thoreau, applicable to young people today, but to all of you here, is what is your Walden? What place, Bob, in the natural world has touched you the most? That something in your life, you sat, you saw a sunrise, it could be a grandmother's backyard, it could be a lake, it might be the Rockies, but there's these epiphanies we have. You can have it very easily here along the ocean, shore. It conjures it. And gives some thought to what's your special place, and then say, am I thinking about how to make sure others experience that? Am I keeping an eye on places that have meant something to me? Am I being a caretaker, or steward, or at least a conscience about a particular, if it's the Poconos, or, it's the, Cape Cod, and get involved a little bit. It could cost $1, it could cost $10, it cost volunteer hours or one day. But if we do that, there'll be a fourth wave, and that it'll meet with the alternative energy, business structure, corporate structure. Jimmy Carter was maligned as president, and he put solar panels on the White House. Solar White House we had. And when Reagan came in, they got ripped down. And I understand, why and all of this, but we're pushing. There's a lot of good thinking on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if the natural world doesn't make the debates. If Trump and Biden debated, they may not even come up because we suddenly deprioritize it. The revolution comes when we prioritize it, and that occurred in the long 60s of 1961 to 73 with tenure of 3 presidents. Jack Kennedy loved the ocean. His Walden was the Atlantic seaboard. He saved Cape Cod, very hard one to do, national seashore. Point Reyes, Marin County, California. So many of the great artists lived, musicians. Padre Island, Texas. Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson did beautification, stopping the vulgarization of America, billboard laws. They saved Redwood National Park in Canyonlands. They did wild and scenic rivers, so we didn't destroy all the rivers. We have scenic stretches that we all own in our country due to that. They did the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Coast Trail, on National Trails Act. It was an involvement on all these levels. And we're waiting for that moment. We're waiting for a Roosevelt, and if you don't get a Roosevelt, it's got to be a people's movement. And when there's ever a people's movement, music, whether it's Woody Guthrie or Joan Baez or Tracy Chapman, or somebody will be there to help keep the spiritual, romantic aspect of saving our environment alive, because that motivates people when you're feeling it. I'm constantly hearing in the social scientists to don't romanticize nature. That's a silly thing to do. I disagree. You romanticize. It is brutal, the ocean, but fall in love with the planet. Because we're spending all this money with satellites, we're heading to Mars, we're heading here, and here's Earth. There's, all the astronauts I've interviewed for NASA. I did the official oral history from Neil Armstrong for NASA. They come back and they think they're heading to the moon, and they sit there stunned, seeing this little, what they called in the 60s, the blue marble, but Earth, just sitting there in this blacky universe. You're not seeing borders. You're not seeing counties. You're not seeing states. You're seeing we're one. And the best of rock and roll thinking, the best of really smart songwriting and orchestral pieces that lend themselves to that, are reminding us that we're of that oneness. So many, you go to see Bruce Springsteen. We saw him, Bob, in Chicago. There are a lot of takeaways. When you see Bruce, my first takeaway is, God damn it, the talent is unbelievable. And then the poise and the integrity and the hard work and the discipline and how he uplifts everybody, that's all there. But he made Wrigley Field seem like one. He made the whole aura was we're all one thing. All of that weird animosity and hatred. And so only music or really fine writing, but harder, or maybe visual imagery and some filming can really pull us all together. So Bruce Springsteen is a uniter of the human soul. You can call it Americana, you call it Jersey Shore, call it working class music, you call it, post Dylan. We can go on and on and on as musicologists, but what he does is come in and pulls us all together in a love for what we've got, and that's a love for the United States. And if you love this country, you have to do what Theodore Roosevelt said: make sure natural resource management, controlling of this, is the number one priority of our nation. Take care of our air, our water, sewage treatment, get rid of industrial blight, do things smartly. Doesn't mean you got to give up your plastic right now. Doesn't mean we're going to immediately turn electric. It means you're willing to recognize that this impulse of saving planet Earth is not pie in the sky, juvenile stuff for babies. I'm a big player now in the money world. It's got to be part of your soul. And if it is, you all will start uniting, and we will be able to tackle some of these thorny issues of today. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was fabulous. So Doug is kind enough to take a few questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, I'm happy to bring the mic over to you. Dr. McKittrick?
Thank you so much. You mentioned whatever vote it was, pro-environmental vote in the Senate, 90.
73, the Endangered Species Act. Of 73.
So if some environmental vote was held today, it would be a question whether it would even pass, and whereas environmentalism, there's the huge climate denial. How do you account for this polarization where on the one hand we have a very strong environmental movement, but we have also a counter-environmental movement?
Well, it's on purpose. If you can follow this, the winds of environmentalism and civil rights and gender issues and all that. But mainly, we focus on race a lot, but environment was what stuck in the craw of a lot of business, not just oil and gas or extraction industries. They didn't like being hyper-regulated by the federal government. And they thought Nixon betrayed them by creating the EPA in the summer of '70. Because these environmental impact statements I was talking about. Nixon becomes an environmental leader. He doesn't like the environment. You can look at his speeches, which I've had, and with the founding document of the EPA, I went to go look at it. I thought there must be feedback. How do you create the Environmental Protection Act? Nixon, it's not out there. Lo and behold, there it is, and next to the original, very romantically written, mixed with law document, Nixon in blue pen writes bullshit. He didn't like the environmental movement, but he was stuck because we were demanding this. But what happened is, due to the successes of Rachel Carsonism, the Earth Day, the challenges of the counterculture and hippies and music and the trends of film, and it was created a counter to that, to undo it, and hence was born the Federalist Society, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation. It worked through Chambers of Commerce, through Lewis Powell, head of the Supreme Court. Powell had been the head chief tobacco lobbyist before he became a Supreme Court justice, and big tobacco did not like being regulated. They didn't want those warnings on the packages. There was a feeling of federal overreach. And there became a movement. They said it'll take 30 or 40 years to be able to even begin to undo what this 60s generation did, because they were caught off guard. The company's fear is what? We're the bad guys, the oil company, we're the bad people. I mean, there was a feeling that with Ralph Nader and others, that the consumer was in charge. And those companies, many of them work with this group, and so now you have a counterbalance. Bob Dylan has that famous song, Ballad of Thin Man, written in '65. Something is happening and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? Well, for the youth, what Dylan's talking to in the 60s, or progressives or whatever, they were mocking not just the press or the backstory of why Dylan wrote the song, but it was Mr. Jones could be Lyndon Johnson. Like Johnson's like, I signed the Civil Rights Act. Why is Dr. King turning on me? They didn't understand the hippies or the counterculture and all this. Something's happening. You don't even know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? You're so square. You're so behind. You're not. The left, progressive today, have become the Mr. Joneses because they don't understand what's going on with Trumpism. They're baffled. They don't understand that the entire regulatory system of the 60s and 70s of Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon is under attack to get rid of the federal government in the lives of corporate business America. And so there's been a battle, and it's at a 50-50 point. But the progressive left's been caught off guard because they were under the belief that you can't undo the Roe v. Wade, you can't undo the Civil Rights Act, you can't undo the cut half of the EPA budget, you can't, and they can. And so that's the wake-up call has to be, it's been a kind of battle, and we haven't had the unity since, Nixon, Watergate. Once Nixon went down, everybody likes to tell the story of Woodward, Bernstein, and the liberals got Nixon. The writer Hunter S. Thompson, the great shark hunt, we're all going to get Nixon and all of this. And it's true enough that the left and progressives went after Nixon and like nobody's business due to Vietnam, but the right broke with them. The Barry Goldwater right, it's when Goldwater tells Nixon, "You're a liar, we're done with you." Because they thought he, for his own legacy, was triangulated, just like he did going to China, that he copped out, and now with his very police-driven, meaning in order to enforce the new EPA, you got to bust polluters. And those bust polluters were extraction industries, factories. And they weren't happy that Nixon played his green liberal card to build his own self-esteem up in history, and they abandoned him. Nixon today is a liberal. Nixon in this environment, it was pro-affirmative action. Nixon is he is not, you're dealing with a new right movement to undo it all. Where's the marker? I think Jack Kennedy's probably okay. It seems like the attacks on Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, the attacks on Nixon's environmental policy, attacks on some things that Jimmy Carter did with environmental lands in Alaska, where they want to drill and not have preserves. But the fight is to get rid of all of that, those victories of the 60s. And so that's where it's at. You could do it as Justice Powell in the famous Powell memo, which said we got to create our own news bureaus, Fox News or right-wing news. We've got to create our own. The universities have been co-opted. With tenure, with New Left, we're stuck with these professors. The money interest has to take over the universities. It becomes a plan of action that's very sophisticated, and people join. And movements can go both ways. And their argument is it's federal overreach. We're a capitalist, laissez-faire country, the federal government. None of us are going to survive. Anything I'm a guy, I'm giving jobs, and I'm getting busted for some rule of the EPA. Remember, everything's about implementing the law. We talk about the Brown versus Topeka decision in civil rights, right? Now, integrated schools, but what is the whole civil rights movement? But making people comply to the Brown, meaning that's all Dr. King's doing. He's got wind at his sail. The federal government's on my side now. But Little Rock, Central High's not complying. New Orleans, France Center, Melleray not complying. And what gave King power is, my view is the federal government's view. It's the Supreme Court. It's the law of the land. It put dissidents and protesters in charge, that Supreme Court decision. Well, ever since the EPA and these regulatory laws of the late 60s and 70s, it's been a challenge to make people live up to it. Instead of forcing companies that are polluting, that are breaking the law, instead of being punitive to them, today's Trump movement says, screw it. Why punitive? Let's just get rid of those laws. And so, it's a fight. And that's what elections are about, but it's a big one now. And that's why I say that's, all of those wins, but then you're getting, it's going back the other direction right now. The only chance is through education, schools, teaching people to love the natural world, getting people back into why you just can't green light every development, construction, environmental, dredging, forest, grasslands. It'll go backwards. So I'm full of hope. And Woody Guthrie, maybe a good place to end here. But Woody, could say I'm a hope machine. what can we do? I'm not going to be coming to teach students and tell them not to hope and fight or be happy, you know. And we're not going to do them any good to sulk and be depressed and hide. And so you have to believe that we can do changes, and we get stuck in places. But I have to admit, we're doing mass destruction of the planet at a very, very fast pace. We may have lost the narrative. It might be unspooling so much. But then I get heartened. I see people doing regenerative farming. And lo and behold, I discovered George Washington Carver, the peanut farmer of Tuskegee, had plans for how to properly use land without fertilizers and all long in the 1940s. And now you're seeing people in Vermont and Northern California following principles that have been there from either Native people or Carver or environmental steward groups and all, and it's starting to get mainstream a little bit. People are recognizing nobody wants to live next to a toxic dump. Nobody wants to raise kids in an environmental hazard zone. And the verdict on nuclear energy is unclear. I have mixed feelings. I've been opposed to it, but I mean, the fossil fuel thing, I mean, we're all spinning right now, but there is a lot of great technology coming out that might be able to be applied. And so you stay hopeful and lean into it and work, have fun saving Earth. Bye, guys. I'll talk more when I'm out around, so if you have something.
Well, thank you again, Doug, for those fabulous remarks. Thank you so much, President Leahy, for your stewardship of this event, and to Bob Santelli for his capable oversight of the archive. We hope everyone will keep in touch at springsteenarchives.org, and you can still grab Doug's book out front if you would like. Thank you so much.
And let me say, such a beautiful campus. When you come here, you feel good because of the way you guys have treated it like an arboretum feel, and it's the green space and all, and it feels beautiful here, so thank you.